When people ask the question, were slaves bred to be stronger? It opens up a doorway into a difficult and often misunderstood piece of history. It's a question shaped by myth, by stereotype, and by the painful reality of slavery itself. To answer it honestly, we have to separate truth from falsehood, history from assumption, and humanity from the dehumanizing language that enslavers imposed. The idea that enslaved Africans in the United States were systematically bred to be stronger, like animals, is not supported by serious historical evidence. What is true is that enslaved people were treated as property, their lives and families controlled, exploited, and violated. But the notion of a deliberate, scientific program of breeding for strength is largely a myth, one that served racist ideologies long after slavery ended. So let's step carefully through this history to understand why the myth persists and what the real story tells us about human resilience and suffering. Slavery in the Americas was not just about work. It was about control, profit, and dehumanization. Enslaved men and women were forced into labor that was physically exhausting. Cutting cane under the hot sun, picking cotton until their fingers bled, hauling loads in fields and workshops for endless hours. Their bodies were pushed to the limits, often with little food, little rest, and constant punishment hanging over them. Enslavers wanted strong, capable laborers, but they were not scientists running experiments. They were businessmen calculating profit. To them, every child born into slavery was more property, more wealth. That meant enslaved women were often pressured, coerced, or outright forced to bear children, sometimes even against their will, with men chosen by enslavers. This was reproduction under violence and coercion, but it was never the systematic breeding for strength that myths describe. It was about numbers, not genetics. It was about profit, not selective science. So where did the myth come from? Much of it grew later, in the 19th and 20th centuries, when pseudoscientists and racist thinkers sought to explain supposed differences between black and white people. They used false theories to argue that black people were naturally stronger, more athletic, and more suited for labor, while at the same time denying their intelligence, their culture, and their humanity. These ideas made their way into popular culture, into sports commentary, and even into everyday conversations. The myth of breeding fit neatly into these stereotypes. If people believed that enslavers had engineered strength through selective reproduction, then stereotypes about black athletes or about physical endurance seemed to have a scientific basis. In reality, it was just a story, one that erased the truth of human suffering and replaced it with a convenient excuse for racism. The truth is harsher and far more human. Enslaved people endured brutal conditions, but they survived not because they were bred to survive, but because they found ways to endure, resist, and persist. They built families even when those families were torn apart. They passed down songs, stories, and skills that carried culture forward. They found strength in each other, in their communities, in faith, and in the will to see freedom one day. The physical endurance we read about in accounts of enslaved labor came not from selective breeding, but from sheer necessity. When you are forced to work 12, 14, 16 hours in punishing heat, day after day, you either collapse or you find a way to push forward. That resilience was born of willpower and survival, not some breeding program. And yet, the legacy of the myth lingers. Even today, in conversations about sports, fitness, or even music and entertainment, echoes of it remain. People still sometimes reduce black people to their physicality, praising strength or endurance while ignoring intellect, creativity, and humanity. These stereotypes are damaging because they strip away individuality and reinforce old ideas rooted in slavery. They make it harder to see the full human being, the full person, beyond the body. That is why it's so important to confront the myth directly, to say clearly that enslaved people were not bred like animals, but were human beings subjected to horrific violence and exploitation. When we ask the question, were slaves bred to be stronger? The answer is no. They were not bred to be stronger. They were forced to live under conditions so harsh that their survival has been mistaken for selective design. They were subjected to violence so deep that family, love, and intimacy were controlled by others. They were resilient not because of breeding, but because of humanity, the same humanity that slavery tried to deny. To honor their memory, we must reject the myths and stereotypes, and instead remember the truth, that millions of men, women, and children endured the unimaginable, and yet managed to survive, to resist, and to leave a legacy of strength rooted not in breeding, but in spirit. So let us close with this thought. When you hear that myth, push back against it. Remember that history is not about convenient explanations, but about people. Enslaved people were not livestock, they were human beings, and their story is one of suffering, survival, and resilience. The strength they carried was not bred into them. It was lived, fought for, and passed down one generation to the next.